and especially to our guest today, Marc David Baer, historian, professor at the London School of Economics, and the author of, I think, 6 books, and the first now being translated to Swedish, Osmanska Riket, Från, kejsare och kalifer, the Ottomans, Khan, Caesars, and Caliphs. It's a great book. It's actually been also reviewed just now in Swedish, and you also had excellent reviews in Swedish. One of the reviewers, Torbjörn Elensky, wrote in tidningen V about this being a brilliant portrayal of one of the big empires in history. And your book has been translated to several languages, I understand?
Yeah, a lot of languages. It just came out in Turkish as well. Turkçe konuşan var mı yoksa? İyi, harika, hoş geldiniz. So it came out in Turkish just a week or 2 ago, and it came out in Chinese, but the Chinese publishers said we could either not publish it, or we can publish it without chapter 13. So what's chapter 13? Is that where the sultan is dethroned and then murdered in a very painful way? So no, that's okay. The problem is the chapter on gender and sexuality. So it violates I said, great. So they published it without that chapter. So I think I'll put it on Weibo or something in Chinese.
Right.
Yeah.
They need to read that chapter as well.
Sure.
And I'm sure they want to. I can understand that also the Swedish translator enjoyed doing his work as much as I enjoyed reading your book. Yeah. But at first, a few words about the title and the difference between the English, the Ottomans, and the Swedish, Osmanska Riket, which is actually closer to the Turkish, Osmanli. And I understand that the word, the Ottoman, it's like a version that came from medieval French via the Arabic translation of Osman to Uthman, etc.
Can be. So what does the Swedish translate then?
It's
Ottoman Empire?
Osmanska Riket. It says.
What's Riket mean?
So we don't say normally the Ottomans, we say Osmanska.
Right.
Right.
But what is Riket?
Oh, that's
Empire.
the empire, sorry.
Right. So it's Ottoman Empire.
Yes.
Which is not what it is in English. Because in English it's about the dynasty, it's about the family.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a slight difference. It's not. There have been other books that have been written about the Ottoman Empire, such as by Caroline Finkel, which covers every aspect of the empire. What's happening in this territory and this territory. But that's not the goal of the book. The goal of the book is to talk about the family, and this family that ruled for over 600 years.
And doing so, you've been making use of your fantastic command of many languages. I am among those Greek, Arabic, Persian, Hebrew, Ottoman Turkish, and Turkish. And which is your favorite language of those?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I like them all. When you're reading Ottoman, so if you're reading an Ottoman chronicle, the Ottoman chronicle would be written in a very simple Turkish that people today, if they knew the letters, could follow. But then they get really excited. They conquer a citadel, and they switch into Arabic. And there'll be an Arabic couplet, which will be wonderful to read. And then they're so excited by having shown you how they know Arabic, then they have a couplet in Persian. And so you translate the Persian, and it pretty much says what the Arabic says, what the Turkish said. But still, I like all these languages. But Ottoman, people don't realize this, but the Ottoman language is a separate language. It's not Eski Türkçe. It's not Old Turkish. It's actually a separate thing. It's a combination. It's an amalgam of Arabic, Turkish, and Persian, written in a modified Persian script. And it's written in there's at least 9 scripts of it. So if you want to read a historical document from the Ministry of Finance, that's written in its own secret coded script. If you want to read a mosque inscription, it's a different script. A tombstone, a different script. So you actually have to go somewhere where there's Ottoman material, and you have to have someone help you learn how to read everything.
And what brought you to study the empire from the beginning as a young student?
Well, I was interested in relations between Muslims and Jews. And growing up, I learned Hebrew. And as an undergraduate, I learned Arabic. So when I went to earn my PhD, I thought, okay, I want to look at relations between Muslims and Jews in history. I know, I'll study Israel-Palestine. Reaction, comment, tomatoes, anything. And I didn't enjoy it at all. I didn't enjoy it because I knew Hebrew, I knew Arabic. So on one day of the week, I would go to the Hebrew table at the cafeteria. Another day of the week, I would join the dance troupe, the dabka troupe, you know. But it was either or. You had to either do Palestinian history or do Israeli history. And that wasn't what I wanted. I was interested in Muslims and Jews doing things together. So then I met a bunch of Turks, right? Okay. Even the taxi driver I had tonight invited me over to his house for dinner, all right? So Turks are super generous people. So I was friends with a bunch of Turks, and they said, you know, if you want to study relations between Muslims and Jews, forget Israel, Palestine, yeah? Look at Turkey. Because we Turks always treated our Jews well. Now, wait a minute, that's a weird way to put it. You know, what do you mean your Jews? You know, we're not owned by anyone, right? So then, but I thought, well, this is interesting. So then the next thing I knew, I was in Istanbul. This is over 30 years ago, and I just fell in love with the city. I mean, Istanbul's an incredible. I'm actually being paid by the Istanbul tourist industry. It's a beautiful city. I absolutely fell in love with it, and never went back to Jerusalem or Cairo after that.
Really?
Yeah.
And being a student in Turkey, you had access to lots of archives, including the Topkapi archives. But were there some archives to which you didn't have access that you were denied to?
Well, yeah, and I started researching in the 90s, which was an interesting time. So, for example, in the 90s, if you wanted to research the Armenian genocide, they had culled all the documents pertaining to that period in the archive, and the guide to those documents was on a wall with cameras facing it. Whereas the guide to the rest of the documents was over here, and you could just go pick up documents, no one would care. But if you wanted to even think about asking for documents about the genocide, you'd be on camera. So who wants to do that? Who wants to be recorded? So, but I did ask for something that turned out to be incredibly sensitive that they never allowed me to see. And this was a 17th century church registry. It's an Ottoman document that lists every single church in Istanbul. All where they're located, what land they own, their dimensions, because they thought that I was some Christian who was going to come here 300 years later and make a claim to certain properties in Istanbul. So then they never let me see that.
Now, going into your book and the findings of the book, there's a one recurrent theme of the book, and that is that the Ottoman Empire, the way you depict it, is as much European as it is Asian. And this is a huge theme, of course, but can you give us some telling examples as to why you want to portray it in this way?
Right. Well, part of it is for the last 10 years, I settled in England. Now I'm British, now I'm living in England. I'm originally from California. And I noticed some things in museums there. So for example, if you go to Hampton Court Palace, which was Henry VIII's, one of his palaces, you have a portrait gallery, and there's a portrait of Henry VIII, and there's also the Charles V of the Habsburg Empire, there's also the King of France, but what's missing is the portrait that he owned of Suleiman. So the curators don't think that that's part of European history, or don't think that's part of Henry VIII's world. But we actually know that Henry VIII enjoyed dressing up like Suleiman. And he would have all his ministers, they'd have banquets, and they'd all go around and act like they were Ottoman pashas, with the turbans and the robes and all that. But that's not part of the history that's taught in England about Tudor England, right? The imagination stops in Central Europe. But the Ottomans were very much part of European history. They're very much part of Swedish history. So probably this country has produced two famous kings in history, right? Charles XII was one of them, right? Charles XII is very famous, along with the other guy named Augustus, right? He was pretty important. Charles XII Karl XII, right? You call him. He ends up in the Ottoman Empire. Why was he in the Ottoman Empire? Because the Ottomans and the Swedes were allies against the Russians, and they were waging a war. The war didn't go well. Charles XII ends up in what is today which is
in
Moldavia,
Moldavia.
in Moldova. He's there, and he's quite depressed. He blew all this money on this campaign that failed, but he realizes that he's eating really good food. He's eating these meatballs, and he's eating these stuffed grape leaf dishes, and he's drinking coffee. So he comes back to this country, And so the story goes, he brings all those things here. Now, the Côte Boulard in this country are pork. You know, he sort of switches the ingredients. But so this is actually, this cultural infusion is part of this country's history, right? And but then if you also look at other countries that are very European, like France, for example. So the French were the allies of the Ottomans. And the French king and the Ottoman Sultan had naval campaigns together. They bombarded cities in France that were controlled by the Habsburgs. The Ottoman navy wintered in the middle of the 16th century in France, in southern France. The Ottomans and the French had a plan to attack Rome together, to go against the Pope. It wasn't realized for different reasons, but they actually had a plan. The Ottomans gave weapons, or planned to give weapons, to the Dutch rebels. Now, of course, Holland, the Netherlands at the time, was ruled by the Habsburgs. The Ottomans had a plan to funnel weapons to those Protestants so they could fight against the Habsburgs, who were the Ottomans' arch enemy. It's a very long list in diplomatic history and cultural history in ways that the Ottomans are very much tied to Europe.
But do you find that some readers find it provocative to depict the Ottomans as part of Europe's history?
Yeah, of course, and some Turks do as well. Some Turks do as well. I mean, some people in both parts of the world want to see the other side as the eternal enemy. I mean, look what, I'm not going to mention it, but a certain ruler of a certain country where everyone speaks Turkish today made a comment about the West. I mean, come on, you know, these politicians, they just want to, you know, and there have been politicians in this country and other countries who just say things trying to pit East against West, when in fact the two areas are completely connected. I mean, the Ottomans, you think about it, the Ottomans first enter Europe in the 14th century, and they're there for 600 years. And this is just not part of the history that we learn or teach about.
I think we'll come back to that topic, but if we go to the sort of the founder of the empire, Osman, one of the horsemen from one of the Turkic tribes who came from Central Asia to Anatolia, and he founded a little principality, Beylik, and in Bursa in northwest Turkey. And after something like 250 years, this had grown to a world empire known by every ruler from Moscow to London, etc. And an empire stretching way beyond the Persian Gulf and covering most of the Mediterranean, the Arab world. So to what did it owe its success in these early days?
That's a big question. I mean, a lot of different things. I mean, Osman was, like you said, he's just a raider. He's just a horseman with his men, Christian, Greek, Turkish, Mongolian, whatever, whoever he can assemble who's on his side. They're raiding against Christians. They're raiding against other Muslims, other Turks. They conquer 4 castles, you know, not too impressive. Although, you know, I never conquered 4 castles, but that's what he did. And so, but it's his son Orhan who takes Bursa, actually. So the Ottomans are always open throughout their history, almost throughout their history, to incorporate people who are going to help them. So what matters is loyalty, not religion, and not even what type of Islam they follow. Osman in his sphere had some really radical Muslim Sufis, these dervishes, these spiritualists. Some went around with naked, some went around just wearing bear skins, others went around with deer antlers on their heads and nothing else. And you could actually go to that guy's tomb, Geikli Baba, outside Bursa. You can go to his tomb today, and there's nothing but antlers around. So he had these different kinds of Muslims, different kinds of Christians around him. His right-hand man was a Greek prince named Köse Mihal. Beardless Mihal. So whoever was there, whoever would help them, the Ottomans kept picking up people. They kept conquering citadels, conquering castles, eventually conquering cities, employing whoever. So they conquer an area, then they start employing Greeks as their scribes. And the first Ottoman archival documents are written in Greek, actually. You have to know Greek to read them. So just whoever's going to help out. Later on, they're going to incorporate Jews. They think that Jews are the best physicians in the world. So the Ottomans, the Sultan's physician, is going to be a Jewish doctor. Whereas in the rest of Europe, countries are expelling, massacring, converting Jews, the Ottomans take them and they say, oh, these people might be useful for us. So that's part of it, this openness to any kind of human material. Also luck. I think luck is important because there were a dozen Turkic principalities in what is today Western Turkey, but only the only the Ottomans succeeded, partly having to do with where they were located. So they were just at the fringe, just at the edge of transportation routes, of where the land is agricultural land versus wild areas. So they're right exactly at the place. They also were able to avoid the Black Death because they were in a slightly isolated place.
How did they avoid that?
Well, the Black Death wiped out all these Turkic principalities on the west coast of Anatolia because they are constantly in trade with Venice and so on. The Ottomans were slightly removed from that. The Ottomans also they always were open in the early centuries to new technologies. And the Ottomans were among the first armies to use gunpowder weapons, so guns. And a lot of the greatest Ottoman victories came when the Ottomans went to the field with artillery and their enemy came to the field with cavalry, so bows and arrows on horseback. And the Ottomans literally blew away the Hungarian army, the Iranian, the Safavid army, and also the Mamluks in Egypt. So part of it is also technological. But it's a very long list of how they did it.
And they were, as you said, extremely pragmatic when it came to religion. And some of the sultans were not great followers of the Sharia, one could say. Some were heavy drinkers.
Well, wine was certainly enjoyed in the Ottoman Empire, for sure, certainly by many sultans. Many sultans never went to prayer because they were too busy drinking and enjoying their Anatolian wine. No Ottoman sultan ever took the pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina. Why? No idea. No one knows why. None ever did it. It wasn't distance. They could have made it. They went farther on their military campaigns. No, the Ottomans were practical. The Ottomans also changed their understanding of Islam over time. So in the early centuries, like I mentioned, you have these really radical spiritualists at court, in their retinue. And the Ottomans held them close because they wanted their blessing. I mean, quite literally, they wanted their blessing so that they could succeed in life. The Ottomans also held them close because if you didn't, these people would rebel. And throughout Ottoman history, especially for the first 3 centuries, there were massive uprisings by Muslims against the Ottoman Sultan. These were Sufis, these were spiritualists who said that their spiritual guide was the one who should be sitting on the throne. He was the chosen one by God, not the one who's actually sitting on the throne.
So the enemies were rebellious Muslims, and the enemies obviously were those on the front lines. But what about the majority population, which for centuries was Christian dominated?
Right. I mean, it's like the Mughal Empire in India. So the Mughals in India are a Turkic Muslim dynasty that's ruling over a majority Hindu society for centuries. The Ottomans are a Muslim elite that's ruling over a Christian majority society for 4 centuries until the society begins to convert more. But the Ottomans had an interesting strategy. On the one hand, they taxed as a levy 1 out of every 40 boys, Christian boys, from their territories, whether they're newly conquered or oldly conquered a while back. So they call this the collection. And these boys then would be converted to Islam. They'd be trained either in the arts of war or governments, depending on their strength, their skill, their mental aptitude, and they would become the leading warriors in the empire, the janissaries, the infantry corps, the elite infantry corps, or they'd become the viziers, the ministers. So the Ottomans created an elite largely from converted Christians. So on the one hand, and you see in Ottoman miniatures how dreadful this tax was. And the Ottomans were aware that mothers of these boys didn't often like their children to be taken away from their home, where they'd forget their motherland and the language and the religion and everything else. So that was going on for centuries. But at the same time, the Ottomans allowed most Christians to be Christian without having to convert to Islam. So they're doing both of these things. They're converting to create a ruling class, but then allowing most people to be as they were.
And this system with the Janissaries created a whole corpse of extremely loyal.
Yeah, they're slaves. They're literally slaves of the Sultan.
But still, they could make a fantastic career, even though being slaves.
Absolutely, absolutely. And also the people who became the viziers, the ministers, they could become super powerful, obviously, and incredibly wealthy. But at their death, all their wealth would revert to the state, because they were also slaves.
If we look upon the way the outside world and also the Islamic world looks upon the Ottoman Empire, it's sort of an ironclad idea of what the empire was like, and so they both those who are Islamophobes and those who are Islamists have, let's say, a false understanding of the Ottoman history.
Right, and also people in the West who don't read Ottoman and don't see what the Ottomans said about themselves also have a false view of history, I would say. I mean, Erdogan, again, I don't like to talk about him, but there was a very popular mini-series on Turkish television about 10 years ago called Magnificent Century, right? Which is really quite good. I'd recommend it. It's on YouTube. In that series, it's a depiction mainly of Sultan Suleiman in the 16th century. And the costumes are right on, and the way they do the palace, and the way they do palace rivalries and everything. But they also, it's a lot about the love interest and the intrigue in the palace, which was really part of it. Because Ottoman sultans had multiple concubines. They had, their mother was also involved in politics. If they had a wife, was also involved. So of course there was intrigue. So Erdogan said, this is not the Suleiman I know. Mm-hmm. The Suleiman I know is always riding on horseback into battle, not always in the harem. All right. Well, actually, Suleiman did all of that, right? He even died on the battlefield at the age of, I don't know, he was quite ancient. So these were human beings. And anytime anyone tries to depict these people as anything but normal human beings with normal desires, then this can be a false depiction.
It's worth thinking about when it comes to the Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul. Suleiman being all of this. That now the conventional wisdom in Europe tells us that religious tolerance began with the peace in Westphalia in 1648, was it?
All right, but as a scholar of Islamic history, I always say actually tolerance began in Europe when in Muslim Spain. Right?
Yes, Andalus, right.
In Al-Andalus, when that's where tolerance began in Europe. In Eastern Europe, tolerance began in the 14th century when the Ottomans began to control that part of the world. But yeah.
The Ottoman Empire was much way ahead of the peace in Westphalia with Mehmed the Conqueror in 1453.
Right, of course. But even before that, when the Ottomans start conquering territory in southeastern Europe, they're introducing a kind of religious tolerance that Western Europe won't understand for several hundred more years. Now again, tolerance is not equality, right? We're talking about pre-modern empires which were based on hierarchies, where men had more rights than women, Muslims had more rights than Christians and Jews, Shi'i Muslims had no rights, Buddhists had no rights, people like that. And also, of course, there was the free and the slave. So I'm not waxing nostalgia for this kind of tolerance, but I'm just saying what it is literally is tolerance, that the Ottomans tolerated. They allowed groups of people to live as they wanted to live, whereas in most of the rest of Europe, with some exceptions, this wasn't even possible. Again, thinking about Jews and how, for example, Jews were expelled from England in 1290. It's not taught in England, actually. It's not taught. I became a British citizen. I had to take the citizenship test. Jews keep coming to the country because it's such a welcoming land. They never were from there. They never were expelled, right? Jews were kicked out in 1290. Spanish conversos, so Jews who were forcibly converted to Catholicism in Spain, begin to come to England in the 17th century, but they're ostensibly Christians. So Queen Elizabeth employs one as her personal physician. But then, because people think he's secretly a Jew, they claim that he tried to poison her, and then he's executed for it. So then Queen Elizabeth, though, meanwhile, is communicating with the Ottoman palace. She's writing letters in Italian. And the person on the other end she's communicating with is a Jewish woman. Because the women of the harem, the women of the royal family, had Jewish women as mediators. So this blew away the English. They couldn't understand. And the fact that the Ottomans also employed hundreds of African eunuchs to guard the royal family also was something that every single visitor from the rest of Europe commented on, because they couldn't understand how could Jews and blacks have such an elevated place in the society.
Mm. And if we go back to Mehmet, the conqueror who took Constantinople in 1453, he didn't change the name of the capital, and the Greek Armenians, they remain in the capital, and he also called himself a Caesar, didn't he?
Yeah, that's right.
For him, there
That's
wasn't any contradiction between being a Caesar, like inheritor of the Roman Empire, and being a sultan.
That's right, and that's why I subtitled the book. With all the Ottomans had three inheritances that they knew about and celebrated, and one was Christian Byzantine. So from the time of Mehmed the Conqueror, from the conquest of Constantinople, Ottoman rulers called themselves Caesar, the Caesar of Rome, Kaiseri Rum. That's what they believed. They believed they were the rightful inheritors of not only the ancient Roman Empire, because they conquered the Byzantines, but also the contemporary Romans, the Habsburgs, in Vienna. And there was a competition to see, and the Ottoman rulers would claim that they should always be crowned emperor, not people such as Charles V. That's part of their title. The Ottomans also always proclaimed and were proud of their Mongol heritage, their Central and Eastern Asian heritage as well. And also the other part of their heritage, of course, was Islamic. So Mehmed II conquers Constantinople. The city is defeated, it's destroyed. His troops had looted it for a day, and he has a decision to make. How is he going to remake the city? The population had fallen to 50,000, whereas it had previously had hundreds of thousands of people. So he decides not to make an Islamic city, but to make a city that befits his empire. So he brings Jews to the city and settles them in the city from his other territories. He brings Greeks to the city from other parts of the empire. He brings Armenians to the city from elsewhere in the empire. And he allows Christians and Jews to build new churches and synagogues, which ostensibly goes against Islamic law. So this is how the Ottomans were. And in his palace of Topkapı, which people have been to, in Istanbul, that he builds, he actually builds 3 pleasure pavilions, places he can go and just relax, drink his coffee. So one of them is in Christian Byzantine architectural style. It doesn't exist anymore. Another one is in Islamic style, also doesn't exist. But the one that still exists is in Turkish Mongol style. You can still visit that at Topkapı Palace. So they embrace these different aspects. So if today we in Sweden or England or in Turkey just see the Ottomans as these Sunni Muslim Turkic peoples, then we're missing out on how they saw themselves.
Mm. But one of the brutal aspects of the Ottoman Empire was the practice of fratricide, of killing one's brothers and uncles if when coming to power. That didn't remain for the whole period, but tell us about this, and how could this system be accepted within the palaces?
Yeah, I mean, in England we have that with the Wars of the Roses, and also with Queen Elizabeth and Bloody Mary and Queen Mary. But the difference is that the Ottomans made it the law of the land. And again, this was because of their Mongol heritage. They realized that the Mongols had conquered the world, but then they divided the empire amongst the different sons of the emperor. And that actually weakened the empire. Because whereas Genghis Khan had one giant empire, his sons had 4 separate ones, which eventually would go their own way. So the Ottomans knew that, and they decided we want to keep the Mongol system, but not divide up territory. So what we'll do is, we'll have a one concubine, one son policy. So when the Sultan had a prince, a male son, with a concubine, the mother and the son, the prince, would be sent off to a provincial capital where they'd be trained in the art of war and governance, with ministers and with the mother there too playing a big role. Then when the Sultan should die by whatever means, then the sons would race to the capital to be the next sitting on the throne, so to speak. Of course, along the way, they would battle their brothers, and the one who was survived would be able to take the oath of allegiance from the Janissaries. So this was the system. Now what happened, so that's what they did. And I always imagined, well, what if we had this in the United States? So there was a president named Bush, and he had two sons. He had Jeb Bush, the governor of Florida, and the other Bush we don't mention, who was the governor of Texas. What if the senior Bush had died, and then the one Bush would take the civil, the National Guard of Florida would fight out with the National Guard of Texas? That's what it's similar to. We didn't have that. So this system was set up in this way, but the thing that began to upset people in the palace and in Istanbul was what happened after the person came to throne was not only would he defeat his brothers in battle or capture them and have them executed, but he also would execute any living male relative that he thought could potentially endanger him. So Mehmed the Conqueror, Mehmed II, for example, had a 2-year-old baby put to death because he thought he might grow up to replace him. Also, there are 70-year-old uncles and other people too. So this system was in place until in the end of the 16th century, when one sultan put to death 18 children, really, of this really was sort of the last straw when people saw 18 tiny caskets being carried out secretly at night from the palace. This was really began to cause a change in policy.
I must ask you, since your book now appeared in Turkish language, what kind of reviews did you get in Turkey?
Well, I haven't seen it. I mean, it literally just came out. It just came out. So no comments.
Quite exciting to see what happens
That's
there.
Right.
Among the different religious communities in the Ottoman Empire who were organized according to the so-called millet system, they have their own leaders. Was there a difference between the Jews having got a safe haven in the Ottoman Empire after the fall of Granada and the Armenians or the Greek?
Well, Jews were always there, actually. I mean, Jews have been in what is today
Right.
Turkey since Roman times. That's forgotten. And partly it's because the Jewish community of Turkey always emphasized its arrival after 1492.
Antiochia used to have, yeah.
But there were the Ottoman Empire had Kurdish Jews, it had Arab Jews, it had Greek-speaking Jews, it had all kinds of different kinds of Jews. You see that the names of the synagogues in Ottoman times, they might have a Spanish name or an Arabic name or a Italian name. So they were quite diverse. But for some reason, the Jews were treated better in Ottoman times than Greeks or Armenians were.
Why?
Can't really answer that. I mean, there's no reason for it, because Christians and Jews should be treated the same by a Muslim ruler. There's no reason to privilege either, of course. But also it depends on the time period. So in the earliest era, the Ottomans, of course, were very keen to incorporate Greeks. So that's why we see even members of the deposed last Byzantine dynasty were even employed in the government, and even before they converted. So we see the Ottomans always take it, but after the conquest, then we see the Greeks playing less of a role. Jews would play a large role in the middle period after they were expelled from Spain in 1492. But then at the end of empire, actually, Armenians would play a larger role. And you would see Armenians in the what's the equivalent of the foreign service and so on. So again, the Ottomans are also thinking about, okay, who can we use best? Who can we benefit best by employing in our in government services?
One community which is not mentioned so much in your book, but which has quite a big presence in Sweden, are the Syriac Christians. What was their situation like during the Ottoman period?
Well, I think they were pretty quiet. I mean, they didn't face anything. I mean, everything changed at the end of empire, and this church, the people in that community, were also subject to genocide at the very end of empire.
If we fast forward through the different decades, we're talking about 600 years of history. It's a fascinating period. And if we shed some light on the private side of the empire or of the rulers, the part that was taken out from the Chinese translation here, sex and gender, etc.
Right.
You write, for instance, about the man-boy love as being something considered perfectly normal, right?
Well, not just normal, but actually the desired relationship. The perfect relationship was that between a mature man and an underage boy. And this is something, again, you asked about how the Ottomans connect to European history and culture, this is something very common in Renaissance Europe. So whether it's in England or it's in France or it's in Italy, the Ottomans also had a religious tradition, the Sufis, the spiritualists, of staring at young boys to appreciate the divine. So this was an actual practice. They would put a poor 8-year-old there, and they would stare at him for hours, and then they would imagine that that God was present. Okay, fine. But then, of course, there were a lot of men who had actual sexual relations with boys, and we know this from the Ottomans themselves. And this isn't 19th century Orientalist, fiction. Actually, it was the Orientalists in the 19th century who wanted to censor all of this. They couldn't handle this. And it's the Ottomans themselves in the 19th century who began to censor this, so that the modern Turkish Republic and the study of literature in modern Turkey absolutely excludes this aspect of literature. But it's there in the writing. So again, Mehmet the Conqueror, he wrote poetry devoted to Christian boys. And it's very explicit. The poetry is explicit, and the target of his love is very explicit. So how can you ignore that? If you're a historian and you're writing about a man who's very impressive as a warrior, because at the age of 21 he took this fabled city of Constantinople, and who also loves women. He also has of course children and has concubines, but then he also finds that the time when he's inspired to write poetry is when he's in love with a Christian boy that he encounters in captured Constantinople. So that's also part of the story that we have to tell.
That's a preferred type of love.
Well, also women weren't available in the public sphere, so men couldn't go around with their wives, for example. That wasn't possible. But you could go to the mehane, the taverna, which is an all-male space, and you drink your wine. Even if you're a Muslim, you drink your wine. Because we know this because the law court records of Istanbul, they don't complain about Muslims drinking wine, but about Muslims stabbing each other at the taverna. So-and-so was at the taverna, and with so-and-so, 2 Muslims, so-and-so stuck the other one in the neck. So we know this from also from law court records. But the other thing is that the Ottomans had this genre of poetry. I don't know how to explain in English other than to say it's about each city, the beloveds of each city. So let's say Stockholm's beauties, I don't know, Göteborg's beauties, whatever. These are all boys, right? So these books about the beloved of each city are describing the boys of the city, the underage boys and their tricks. One poet decided to write a book about the women of Edirne or something, and everyone laughed at him. And you see all these other writers criticizing him, saying, why would you write a book about the women?
But you do have a chapter called Harem Means Home.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes against the general Orientalist view of the harem. Can you explain? What was the harem?
Yeah, I mean, harem comes from the word for just private. The harem is just the private quarters of the sultan or any wealthy person who could afford to have this kind of a setup. It's just where the sultan lives, and it's where women live and children live. That's all it is. I don't want to. It's not like you see in the Orientalist paintings where you have just row after row of naked women, and the sultan just goes in there and picks. It wasn't like that at all. It was actually quite unerotic, because actually usually the sultan's mother would pick who he's going to have children with, which is kind of a turnoff. So the sultan could have many concubines, but they also were chosen for their education. Because they're educated, because they're articulate, because they could play an instrument, because they could recite poetry in 5 languages, along with being beautiful. And so these women are also brought into the palace and converted. These women are also, in the early centuries, a lot of them are Byzantine princesses, Serbian princesses, Armenian women, and so on. Turkish women as well. But then in later centuries, they're going to be especially Russian and women from the Caucasus. They're brought in, they're converted to Islam. So there's this popular series on Netflix now. Actually, I spend all my time watching these series and reviewing them. There's a series.
Swedish series.
I also watch Swedish, but they have nothing to do with the Ottomans. But so this one series, it's called Rise of Empires, the Ottomans, right? Okay. So there you have the wife of Mehmed the Conqueror, Mehmed II, as a Christian. And she was. He had a Serbian wife. That's true. But she's wearing a cross. I don't think so. I don't think she would have been walking around the palace in a cross, with a cross on. That's not possible. Also, he serves her Turkish delight, which was invented 300 years later. But okay, fine. That's no big deal. But so these Christian women were brought in. They're educated just like the boys were, and converted as well.
Among the women in the palaces, is there anyone that you find particularly interesting?
Well, the most famous one goes by Roxolana in the West, or Hürrem Sultan. There's also a series about her in Turkey. She's famous because she actually changed a lot of things. So sultans up to that point had not married. They just had partners who were concubines. And again, I mentioned the one mother, one son rule. But Suleiman changed all that with Hürrem. So he kept sleeping with her. He kept having sons with her, which went against precedent. And he also married her. He had to free her from slavery. The concubines were slaves. He freed her from slavery in order to marry her, because you can only marry a free woman. So this was very unprecedented. And after Suleiman is the point when women move into Topkapı Palace. So again, going back to a previous question, when Mehmed the Conqueror built Topkapı Palace, he built an all-male palace. It was only for men. And you could say the harem was an all-male harem, because the palace was a training school for boys who were brought in to be converted and trained to be the viziers and the soldiers. It was his residence. It was the seat of government where he had his council meetings. But no women were allowed in Topkapı Palace for a century. The only women allowed were there was a chamber next to the Sultan's bed chamber where the concubines could come for the night and then be secreted out. But there's no women in the palace, just a male space. After Suleiman, the sultans decided to bring women into the palace. So the women to that point were at what's called the Old Palace in the central part of the peninsula of Istanbul. And that's where the concubines, mothers of sultans, grandmothers, wives, and children were. But after this point, in the late 16th century, all those people then move into the palace. So then it becomes a different place when women are at the center of politics. And that's why within a century, women become especially influential in Ottoman politics.
Now, in the 19th century, the Russian Tsar Nicholas I called the Ottoman Empire the sick man of Europe. And this was the time of the rise of nationalism in the Balkans, etc. But looking back on history, was it doomed to fall, or could anything have saved this multi-religious, multinational empire? Okay,
it's a big question.
Yes, 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Going back to, the sick man of Europe, and everyone focuses on the sick man part. But in my book, I focus on the of Europe part. And that's the key part of the phrase, is that this is a empire which is part of Europe. How is it going to fit into the future of Europe? How is Russia going to fit in? People thought Russia would fall, right? So called it the sick man of Europe, but actually Russia was the sick man at that time because they were, in a way, defeated in the Crimean War. But the Ottomans, after the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, the Ottomans sided with Britain and France against Russia. It was the first mass death in a war that we've seen in history, from disease and so on. After that war, the Ottomans find themselves really tightly bound to Britain and France, and in debt. And so within a couple of decades, they find that there are British and French people in their government running their finances, basically, right? So the Ottomans become more and more connected. They become weaker. Again, the Ottomans had always adapted technology. They had always incorporated all the human material at their feet. But they lost the technological edge by the 17th century. Other nations, other empires, especially in Central Europe, especially the Habsburgs and then the Russians, had surpassed them in military strength. And then we have, from 1789 on, we have this thing called nationalism. And different people in the Ottoman Empire begin to believe that they'd be better off ruling themselves, right? And so we have these famous uprisings by the Greeks, 1821, the Serbians, 1831, and so on. So the Ottomans start losing territory, and the Ottomans have to start figuring out, well, how can we hold it together? What can we do? We've fallen behind to other empires. We're losing territory. What will hold our people together? And they try everything. They try democracy. In 1876, they promulgate a constitution, and they allow for a parliament. But this is ended 2 years later because Russia invades and nearly conquers Constantinople in 1877. The Ottomans panic, and they turn to dictatorship and censorship and authoritarianism in the late 19th century under Abdülhamid II. So, but even under Abdülhamid II's deposed, the Young Turks come to power in 1908, 1909. There's a real chance that the Ottoman Empire can be refashioned in a way that's going to keep the peoples who want to remain in the empire, those Greeks, those Serbs, those whoever who want to stay there. There's a feeling of, brotherly love, sisterly love, 1909. But I always say the Ottomans have no time. They don't have time to realize any of their plans at that point. Because 3 years later, all the Balkan nation states that have once been part of the empire gang up on the Ottomans and attack, and again, almost take Constantinople. And then there's a second Balkan War, and the Ottomans lose Salonika, Thessaloniki. They lose southeastern Europe, from which most of the Young Turks are going to claim is the real fatherland. Not Turkey. It's much later that Turkey becomes the home of the Turks. Southeastern Europe is the real heartland. They lose it. So they panic. They absolutely panic. They begin to ethnic cleanse Greeks from the western part of the empire. There's massacres. Muslims are being massacred in southeastern Europe. Christians are being massacred in southeastern Europe. There's massacres in the Caucasus. Muslims are massacring Christians. Christians are massacring Muslims. So this is the time period. And then, even worse, the First World War breaks out. And the Ottomans at first, the Young Turks at first, thought they could side with Britain. And they made overtures to the British, which would have been clever. But they fell through. They dropped. They didn't work. So then they sided with Germany, which, as we know, was a horrible decision. But it made sense because the Ottomans the Young Turks had very close personal and intellectual and commercial relations with Germany. So they side with Germany. And the war is cataclysmic for the Ottomans. The Ottomans' population suffers the greatest proportional death and wounding rate and disease rate of any combatant in the First World War. If you do it proportionally, not by population. So the Ottomans suffer. Every Ottoman citizen suffers. Every group in the empire. But within that also, the government decides, the regime, the Young Turk regime, decides to annihilate the Armenian population. Because they believe the Armenians are siding with the Russians who are taking territory in the east. So this is another bad decision. And it leads, again, to ruin, not only for the Armenians, but also it devastates the land. So at the end of the war in 1918, it's a very difficult situation for the rump of the empire that remains.
And then comes Mustafa Kemal, the officer, the military commander who fought on the Gallipoli and he fought the British there, the founder of the Turkish Republic. Now, at the time of the Armenian genocide, he was preoccupied on the Gallipoli in the Dardanelles.
In 1915, 1916, yeah.
Exactly. But could you say that he, to any extent, share some of the responsibility or the guilt of the Armenian genocide? I mean, he came, after all, from the same roots as the
Young Turks.
Pashas.
Yeah. He also was a member of the Young Turks.
And also, I mean, a genocide is not a one-time event. It's a continuous event when you try to annihilate history, memory.
Well, that's the part he participated in. Well, first of all, let's be honest. I mean, in his circle of men were perpetrators of the genocide. And many of the men that he appointed in his government that would serve in the Turkish government until the 1940s were people who had, first of all, people who had expelled the Greeks in 1915. That person would become the president of the Turkish Republic. Individuals who were governors of regions that implemented the genocide in the southeast would become ministers of government, and there's a half dozen of these men. So the men around him were guilty of committing genocide, if not Ataturk. But what Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal, did was, what he did was even more important, was he established the historical narrative of the Turkish Republic, the narrative that was taught until recently in every Turkish classroom for generations, and that was enshrined in all their museums and everything else. And that was all came in a speech he gave, a 6-day speech. I mean, even I couldn't speak for 6 days straight. A 6-day speech he gave to Parliament, which is called the speech. What else could they call it, right? It's called the speech, nutuk, in Turkish. And in that speech, he begins Turkish history in 1919. Right. So this is clever, right? History begins with him. He's the phoenix rising from the ashes. Turkish history begins with him coming ashore from the Black Sea into Anatolia. That's where the story begins. So if you begin the story in 1919, then all that from the past can just be brushed over, forgotten about, or denied, because, Turkey begins in 1919. In that speech, though, he does blame Armenians for committing atrocities against Turks and so on. So it was all set. So the memory was set by that speech, even if he didn't perpetrate any crimes himself. Mm. But let's go back a second. Before you mentioned Mustafa Kemal, I mean, we have to also, you asked the question of what could have happened. I mean, the Young Turks, despite all the difficulties, they could have gone a different way, other than genocide and total war. And the Ottoman Empire was ruled from 1913 to 1918 through martial law. So that's the suspension of law for every citizen, right? So they got rid of every single freedom that had been given in 1908 and 1909. But it didn't have to be that way. One of the key allies of the Young Turks in parliament was an Armenian political party. Some of the people that Talat Pasha ordered murdered, he knew personally. They had played, with one guy in particular, they played chess together. They were friends, right? So it didn't have to be this way. They could have come up with a way to save the empire that was democratic, or they could have had a federation. They could have given autonomy to regions. There were a lot of possibilities. They didn't have to turn to dictatorship. The other thing I was going to say was that it's not such a simple path from empire to republic as it's usually told. So in 1918, the land is ruined. The population is ruined, right? So many people have died, have been deported, a genocide. So many soldiers have died. And now there's two competing factions, in fact. So there's the Sultan, there's still a Sultan in Istanbul, which is occupied, and there's his army and his supporters. And then there's this group of Muslims. They don't call themselves Turks. They call themselves Muslims. And this includes Turks and Kurds and Arabs and other Muslim peoples. And they call themselves the Defense of Rights Committees. They're the defense of the rights of the Muslim peoples in Anatolia. And also northern Iraq. Everyone forgets that. And northern Syria. Everyone forgets that. They're going to just save the Muslim empire for Muslims. They feel like the Sultan's a traitor. They're the true Ottomans. And they actually fight battles, Muslim against Muslim, the Sultan's army versus these rebels. They also fight against the occupying Christian nation armies, the Italians, the Greeks, and so on. And they also commit massacres against the surviving Christian communities in what is today Turkey, and also what is in Iraq and Iran. So this is something that is forgotten. We think that a secular Turkish state just appeared after that, but it didn't. 4 years of fighting, 1918 to 1922. By that point, then, you have a group that's coalescing around Mustafa Kemal that's going to get rid of the Sultan. And the last Sultan leaves on a British naval vessel, goes to Malta. These guys will come to power, so Mustafa Kemal and his men, and then they're going to turn against all those people that sided with them. They're going to turn against the Arabs. They're going to turn especially against the Kurds. And so already in 1925, you have the new Turkish state is using the new weapon of aircraft to bomb Kurds and committing massacres against Kurds. So then after 1925, then you have the creation of a Turkish state.
But if we, a few words about the Kurds and during the Ottoman Empire, was it easier to be a Kurd under the Ottomans than in the early days than in today's Turkey?
Of course, 100%. If you want to be a Kurd, if you want to speak your language, you want to live as a Kurd and say, I'm a Kurd, of course the place to do that is the Ottoman Empire. Because the Kurds predominantly reside in the southeastern part of, on the borderlands with the whatever Iranian empire there was at the time. And they were given pretty much autonomy. So they were given arms and freedom to do whatever they wanted so long as they would fight against the external enemy. But there were Kurdish governors and there were Kurdish soldiers and Kurdish everything. So that was the situation for much of Ottoman history after they conquered the region of Kurdistan.
Time is running fast here. I was hoping I have some questions from the audience, but I just want to ask you before that. I mean, Turkey is an ever-changing atmosphere, but you write that the Turkish nation was based on forgetting. And if we look back on all these events, the genocide, the persecution of Kurds, others, do you find any climate that could be conducive to digging up the memories in Turkey?
Well, there's a lot of outstanding Turkish historians, Turkish and Kurdish and other historians from Turkey who have been doing amazing work ever since ever. I mean, some of them have been jailed, some of them are jailed now, but there's always amazing Turkish scholars from Turkey who carry out research that's honest and realistic about the past.
Right, so if we have a microphone, maybe we can take two very short questions from the audience, and that should be short, not comments, questions. Is somebody wants to ask a question? Just raise your hand. We have microphones here, I think. Yes. No, the microphone, Anders. Here is one of your reviewers.
Oh.
Yes.
Okay.
Anders,
I hope you were kind.
I very much enjoyed the book. You mentioned the Chinese edition, missing this chapter again about gender and sexuality. What about the pieces about the genocide in the Turkish edition?
It's all there. It's all there. I mean, I wrote Turkey's an interesting country because you could publish and find almost anything in bookstores in Turkey, in fact. And Turkey has a great publishing industry where they translate everything. So a lot of scholarship written outside of Turkey is widely available in Turkey. Yeah, I wrote another much more controversial book about, it's a history of Turkish Jews, but it's Ottoman and Turkish Jews. So it covers 500, 600 years. But it's also about how Ottoman and Turkish Jews have told their story. And part of telling their story for the past 100 years is to deny the Armenian genocide. So I write about that. It hasn't come out yet. It was supposed to come out a year ago. And I told it's an Armenian press in Turkey. And I told them that, you decide which parts that you could include and which parts you cannot. Because you live in Turkey, I do not.
Well, thank you, Marc. Not only are you a great speaker, as everyone can tell here, but you're also a fascinating writer. And I truly recommend you to read the book here. So I think we should give Marc David Baer a warm hand.
Thank you.